to see everybody out on this kind of cold Colorado night. I think I have something to start with here that you'll probably be interested in. And this goes right along with kind of what we're talking about tonight. And it builds on the old Jeff Foxworthy thing of, you might just be a redneck or whatever, except this one is you might just be a farmer. So we're going to go through a couple of these here. If your dog spends more time each week riding in your truck than your wife does, then you might just be a farmer. If the 5-gallon bucket hydraulic oil comes in is almost as valuable a tool as the actual oil, then you might just be a farmer. If you've ever used baling wire to attach a license plate or to square up a bale of hay on the roof of your wife's car, then you might also just be a farmer. If you've driven off the road while rubbernecking your neighbor's crops or cattle, you might just be a farmer. If you've ever used duct tape and a bandana as a bandage, then you might just be a farmer. If you refer to land using the names of the farmers who owned them generations ago, then you might just be a farmer. If the equipment under your barn is 10 times more valuable than what is parked in your garage, then you might just be a farmer. If buying new clothes and boots means your church clothes can now be used for work, you might just be a farmer. If family picnics are the tailgate of your pickup truck during harvest season, you might just be a farmer. If your tractors and combines have working air conditioners, but your truck does not, you might just be a farmer. And the last one, if spending time alone with your wife in the evening means she is holding the flashlight while you fix something, then you might just be a farmer. So I thought those were kind of cute. We are looking at Mark chapter 5 here, as we have been kind of going through things. We've been talking, the last few weeks we talked about Jesus being the servant. The first?
4, not 5.
Did I say 5? Oh, sorry, Mark 4. Mark 4, yeah, sorry, skipped the whole chapter there. Yes, Mark chapter 4. So we've been talking the last couple of weeks about different things. Go back one slide for me for a second. The Gospel according to Mark, Jesus the servant king is kind of the theme. But another theme that we have kind of talked a little bit about, and one thing that Jesus will be asking his disciples later on is, who do you say that I am? And these are all pictures of Christ as we are looking through these. And so in chapter number 1, we looked at Jesus as the servant. In chapter number 2, we looked at Jesus and his authority. Last week, we looked at Jesus and his chosen fellows, the disciples. And this week, okay, now you can go on to the next one. This week, we are looking at Jesus' storytelling. And as we look at this, I want you to kind of keep this in mind. This is kind of the theme through the whole chapter here of Jesus the storyteller. And I'd like for you to say something with me here. So, Ata. Say it again. Ata. Okay. Akin. Akito. Okay. So Ata, Akin, Akito. Ata, Akin, Akito. Which basically translated means ears to hear, let them hear. And that's going to kind of be one of our central themes as we kind of go through this week. So, a thing that Jesus was telling his disciples and was telling the people was to listen and understand. And that's kind of the whole theme of chapter 4 here as we begin to go through this. Knowledge is very powerful to you and me. It's kind of interesting because when we were growing up in the church, a lot of times, knowledge was kind of put down and it was set on the back burner, and it was more important to be spiritual than to have knowledge. And so, unfortunately, what we have a lot in Christianity, were a lot of spiritual people, but they were very uneducated. And one of the scriptures that they always went to was the Garden of Eden, was that Adam and Eve could not eat from the tree of knowledge. They could only eat from the tree of life. However, that's kind of taken out of context, because if you actually read the scriptures, it wasn't the tree of knowledge, but it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they were forbidden. So it didn't mean now, of course, that we can't have an education and that we can't have knowledge and that we can't learn things. But the knowledge piece of it is kind of interesting. And as we go through this a little bit, you and I can probably remember when we were in school, and maybe you had a teacher that was very instrumental in shaping your life. Now, I went to a Christian school. I went to Bellevue here in Denver all of my life, from first grade all the way through graduating high school. And I had some really incredible teachers. I write about them sometimes in my fiction, and I'm very honoring of them. And I had various ones that taught me a lot of different things and really impacted my life a lot because of the different ways that they taught. And sometimes it was just sitting there and just listening to them talk about a particular subject that they understood and that they knew, but they were basically sitting there and they were telling us a story of how these things come about. And when I got older and I also became an instructor and became a teacher, the type of stories and things and the examples that I would use would be the ones that touched my students the most. And they would come up to me and they would say, you know, I've never had anybody explain that like that, and it made sense to me now. So as we look at this, and as we're looking at Mark chapter 5, it's all about story. Now, you know that I'm all about story. I love stories. Did I say Mark 5 again?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Correct me. I don't know why I'm so far ahead doing it. Okay, so Mark chapter, because I got Mark chapter 4 right here. Okay, so as we look at Mark chapter 4 again, we're looking at story. Stories are things that have been passed down now from generation to generation to generation. And I was thinking about what is it in our lives and in our history that has actually touched and changed civilization as we have moved through it. There are a couple of things that were kind of instrumental, basically, in civilization. One of the first things was fire, the discovery of fire, and not exactly sure where it came from, if you think about it. Now, scientists and evolutionary people believe, of course, that we came from cavemen, and the cavemen came from apes, and the apes came from some big bang that happened, and everything was all thrown together and all that type of thing. But if you and I believe the Bible, it's like there are instances of fire in the Bible, but it doesn't really tell that much about where fire came from. It must have come, through creation somehow. I can think of some different areas of fire in the Bible. I can think of, fire being called down from heaven. I can think of Moses and the burning bush. I can think of, all kinds of different instances of fire and sacrifices and various things, but we don't exactly know where it came from. But that was something that was innovative. Obviously it kept mankind warm, it kept us from perishing. And so we had fire. We also had language, because that began to develop, and those things started to come in a little bit. And so that was kind of the area of the hunter and gatherer. And then as we go through in civilization, we come into the agricultural era, and cities begin to grow, and cities begin to build up, and the wheel comes into existence, and we have money that's there, and writing starts to come into existence, and they start to write all these different things down. And then after a little while, then all of a sudden the industry emerges, and we have the Industrial Revolution, if you ever studied that in school. And as that began to come in, we have the inception of the printing press with Gutenberg, and we have the steam engine that comes in that revolutionized a lot of things. And then we have the discovery of electricity and producing electricity. and that begins to come in as that came in. They say that the most significant century was 1870 to 1970, and that's where most of our innovations and most of our things begin to come from. We see as we go through history that those things are kind of built up, and then we see at a certain point a guy by the name of Tim Berners-Lee who comes to the forefront. And he is actually the architect of the World Wide Web. So it wasn't created by Al Gore. So it was Tim Berners-Lee who brought that in. And they begin to figure out how it was through communication that they could network all of these things. Now they had before, of course, radios and telegraph and all of those types of things, and then you had movies and various things that came in. Linus Torvalds,
Linux.
yeah, the Linux kernel. He was instrumental in building the Linux platform, which started to come in and bring in the computers and supercomputers, and Eric and I were talking a little bit about quantum computers and all, and so that was kind of the platform with that. And then, of course, more recently, you and I know about Steve Jobs, and we also know about Steve Wozniak. Both were the founders of Apple, and Wozniak was kind of he was really kind of the technical brains behind the inception of Apple. They built their first ones in Steve's garage, and that kind of came into that. And then
They were actually contemporaries with Linus as well.
Yes, they were. Yeah, because Linus was there too, and they were contemporaries with him. And so all of those things started to come into being, and it's fascinating to me. They say that there's certain things that are just kind of floating around out there in the ether, right? And we, of course, as Christians, we believe that it's providence of God, that God begins to release certain amounts of knowledge through history at certain times and at certain intervals, because people start to develop various things. Because we had Westinghouse, and we had Tesla, and we had Edison, thank you. That all began to work with electricity kind of at the same time. And who was going to be first, who was going to market it, and all that. And so it's almost like there are those type of things that are kind of floating around. And this is kind of the way that it was with the World Wide Web, with computers, when you have Wozniak and you have Steve Jobs, and then you have Steve Ballmer, who Bill Gates hired to come and work at Microsoft, and later on he became CEO. And of course you have Paul Allen, who was one of the brains behind Microsoft. It's kind of funny because, as I was teaching at New Horizons Computer Learning Centers, I taught technical classes and things, and I had a guy in my class. I think I've told you the story before, but I had a guy in my class, and he came up to me after class, and he said, I remember when I started this company out in California, and these two young guys came to me and wanted jobs. And so I was interviewing them, and during the interview, one of them said something about coding that the other one disagreed with, and all of a sudden they got in this fight there over this code, over this computer code. And he said, I sat back and crossed my arms, and I thought, these guys are never going to amount to anything. And he said, one of them was Bill Gates, and the other guy's name was Paul Allen. And he said, I shoot myself now for not hiring him. I also taught another guy who was Steve Wozniak's best man when Steve got married. And so it's kind of interesting because I taught a lot of computer history and things at that time. And so it was interesting for me to actually talk to people who knew these people. And so they weren't just, pictures on the news or the NASDAQ or whatever. And so all of these things have come into being. Now, as we have seen this down through history with all of this, there is a constant that has run through here that is important with Mark 4, and that is story. Because stories have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. They started out auditory, and then they begin to write those down. And those things are things that you and I have have a part in also, because this is the way that we pass on things to our children and to our grandchildren, of just sitting and telling stories. You know, everybody likes to hear a story. Whether it was at bedtime or around a campfire or whatever it is, it's a story. And we like to hear that. Marge, I would like for you to read verses 1 through 12, if you would, of chapter number 4. And Kurt, you can just kind of keep up with her.
Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked out the plants so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times." Then Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear."
Stop there for just a second. Ada, Keen, Akito. Okay, now go ahead.
When he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, "The secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise they might turn and be forgiven." Then Jesus said to them, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word."
You can actually stop right there. I'll read this one. So Jesus is here and he's teaching. And we saw last week that he would bring the people down to the shore, and he would have a boat waiting there, and he would climb into the boat, and they'd row out a little bit, kind of like a natural amphitheater, and he would teach the people, and the reflection of the water would help his voice to carry. But he had to do this because he couldn't be pressed on every side with the people. He comes down, and what he begins to do is the word here is parabole. He begins to show and he begins to teach what we call a parable. Parable means, or parabole means to cast something alongside of something else. And so he taught them spiritual things using a natural account. It's in the same way that if I'm going to teach somebody how to work with wood or how to fix a car or how to do a computer or something, I'm going to try to relate to them a story that they can understand in order to teach them a principle. And that's what Jesus was doing. He wanted to teach the people spiritual principles, but he had to use natural stories in order to do that. So in verse number 13, he says to them, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seeds along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in their hearts. Others, like the seed sown on the rocky places, they hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes, because of the world, they quickly fall away. Still, there are others, like seeds sown among the thorns. They hear the words, and then the worries of this life, the deceitfulness and the wealth of the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Others, like the seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop, some 30 and some 60 and some 100-fold, as it is sown. Jesus is teaching this parable, and he starts to talk to them about three things. He talks about the seed, he talks about the sower, and he talks about the soil. Now, in this particular area in Israel, and as it is even now as we farm, there's a path that usually is walked on all the time, or it's driven down all the time now. And as he's talking about this, he's talking about this path that's in between the different fields that is very hard. It's hard soil, it's hard clay, and they walk on it. They have the carts that go down it, the animals walk down it, and all. And it is a path that is very hard. And so the first thing that he says is that as the sower goes out to scatter the seeds, he's throwing the seeds in all kinds of different directions. Part of the seeds land on that hard path. And in this particular case, and we had talked about earlier a little bit about birds, and we love birds. We love birds in the backyard and all. But in this particular case, he likens the birds unto Satan. Now, I'm not telling you that birds are satanic, okay? But I'm just talking about just in this particular parable, in this particular story that he's talking about. He's talking about the birds being like Satan. Because what happens is that the seed goes out onto the path, and the birds come down and immediately pick it away. You can have people that listen to the Word of God, and it just falls on hard ground. It's not going to penetrate them. They don't have the experience with the Lord. And this is what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about this seed as it comes down and hits that hard ground. Then he says some of the seeds, it's going to fall on some of the dry ground, but it's going to fall in an area that there are thorns. And you and I experience this if you just walk out in your driveway in the middle of summer, right? Because that little bit of dirt that gets in those expansion joints of your driveway or your sidewalk, all of a sudden you see a dandelion crop up. Or you see some other little weed. Do you know the difference between a weed and a plant? If you pull the weed, if you pull it and it comes back, it's a weed. If you pull it and it doesn't come back, it's a plant. And so especially in Colorado here, we have millions upon multiplied millions of weed seeds in all of our yards. Because that is the way that we function here in Colorado. And if you're going to have a good yard, you've got to be after it constantly. Because it's always going to be there. It's always going to be cropping up. And one day you might have one dandelion, and they're wonderful and they're beautiful and nice little yellow flowers. And if you let it go, a couple days later, you're going to see 2 or 3 of them there. And a couple days later, you're going to have more. And finally, after a couple of weeks of just letting the dandelions be and letting them be who they're going to be, they are prolific and they are all over the place. Then you've got a whole yard that's full of dandelions, right? That's what Jesus is talking about. Because he's talking about that there are seeds that come and the seed falls into some dirt and the seed begins to grow a little bit. But what happens is that the sun beats down on it and it starts to wither and it starts to die. And the reason being is because it doesn't have any root. It doesn't have any ground. So we've got folks that listen to the word and immediately Satan comes in and wants to, take it out from them. And then we've got people that listen to the word and they become a Christian, but they don't have root. And they don't have grounding and they don't have teaching. We see this a lot on social media. We see it a lot out on the web. We see it a lot in Hollywood. We see it a lot with famous people. We rejoice when famous people come to the Lord. They start making a confession of faith. And then, a few months later, now all of a sudden they're kind of back out doing, whatever they were doing before, right? And the reason being is because they didn't allow themselves to be rooted and grounded. And we in the church sometimes do them a disservice because we say, oh, so-and-so became a Christian. Let's get them out on the speaking circuit and they're going to be going around to all the different churches and all the different conferences and speaking. And they have no depth and they have no grounding and they have no root. And all of a sudden they're out there and they're just saying crazy things and they're saying, all kinds of weird stuff that are not biblical because they don't have any root and they don't have any grounding. And this is what Jesus is telling his disciples about. And then we've got some others that that the seed falls on kind of the ground where the weeds are. And the good seed starts to come up, but then the weeds, being so prolific, come up and choke out all the good stuff, right? And Jesus likens this up to just kind of the cares of the world. And just not caring a whole lot, wanting something that's good, wanting the good things of the Lord, wanting the good things of the Word, but yet there are different cares of the world and different stresses and different busyness and all of that just come up and they just choke it out. And the seed doesn't continue on the good ground because our job gets in the way, or school gets in the way, or our friends get in the way, or the neighbors get in the way, or our relatives get in the way, or whatever, and all of a sudden we're not really serving the Lord like we should because we're just weighed down by just the cares of the world. Right? And so Jesus is telling his disciples, when I'm telling you these stories, those of you who have ears to hear spiritually are going to hear and you're going to understand. And that's what Jesus wants of us. That's what God wants from us, is that when we are, when we're looking at the Word, when we're studying the Word, let the Word come and begin to take root. Because then Jesus goes on and he says, but some of the Word falls on good ground. And when it does, it gives you a 3,000% return. It gives you a 6,000% return. It gives you a 10,000 or 100,000% return on the investment there. And that's the way that it needs to be with us. And that's what it is that Jesus is talking about here. Now, Marge, go ahead on verse 21 through 25.
He said to them, do you bring in a lamp to put it under a bowl or a bed? Instead, don't you put it on its stand? For whatever is hidden is meant to be disclosed, and whatever is concealed is meant to be brought out into the open. If anyone has ears to hear, let them hear. Consider carefully what you hear, he continued. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you, and even more. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them.
Okay, so again, he says, get your ears on and listen to what it is I'm telling you about. And he uses another story. Now, these particular lamps, they were basically clay pots, and they kind of had a little spout at one end and kind of a little handle at the other. And out that spout was where the wick would go, and these were filled with oil. And so the wick would go down in there, and it would soak up the oil, and they would light it. Most of the homes back then, if they were just common homes, they just kind of had a little shelf that was kind of jetting out of the clay, and you would take that lamp and you would set it there, and it would kind of light the whole room, right? If it was a fancier house, they actually had more type of lamp stands that they would put these on, and then they would light them. So Jesus is saying here, if you've got a light, there's no way that you're going to take that light, you're going to hide it under your bed, or you're going to put some kind of a cover over it or something. And this is kind of what we were talking about, with blessing you all with your houses, with your new houses and things, of shining and being a light in the community. And Jeannie read from Matthew 5, which goes along in the same area with Mark 4, about that light and about that light shining wherever we are. And that's what it is with you and me. We've all heard the adage, bloom where you're planted, right? That's the way that it is with you and me. God puts you in your neighborhood next to your neighbors, or at your place of business, or your, in the midst of your friends, or your school, or wherever it was, for a reason. Because he wants you to be a light. He wants you to be seed. He wants you to sow the word into people. He wants them to understand his word, and for you to tell them stories of how to understand the word. And then he also wants you to be that light. And this is exactly what he was talking about here. Okay? 26 here. He also said, this is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground, night and day. Whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself, the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the hand. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it because the harvest has come. What Jesus is talking about here is he's talking about the word sprouting and God being able to harvest it at that point. When that seed comes into us and begins to grow, then God comes to us at a certain point and he says, now it's time for you to go forth and do these things. And that's what it means, putting the sickle in harvesting. He's bringing people in to minister and to send them out into the world to be able to minister on these things. Okay? Now, Marge, would you read the next area there, 33 and 34?
Again he said, what shall we say the kingdom of God is like? Or what parable shall we use to describe it? It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all seeds on earth. Yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all garden plants, with such big branches that the birds can perch in its shade.
Now, when he's talking about this, he talks about mustard seed a lot. And one of the most famous areas that he talks about mustard seed is what? Faith. Exactly. Faith is a grain of a mustard seed. You can say to this mountain, be moved, and it will be moved and cast into the sea, right? If you've ever seen mustard seed, it is a very, very tiny seed, right? When he's talking about this type of mustard plant, he's not just talking about something that is in your herb garden. But in this particular case, as he is talking about this type of mustard plant, they actually grow into mustard trees. And they are big enough for birds to come and to roost in them and to make nests in their branches. And as we go along with this in chapter 4, as he was talking earlier about the birds being not good and coming down and plucking the mustard seed away, he is talking about here that even when you have the mustard seed and it begins to grow and it begins to grow into the mustard tree, there are still the birds that come and roost in the nest. They nest in the branches there. So even though that mustard seed begins to grow in us, you can still expect that kickback from Satan that wants to come in and he wants to destroy. He wants to destroy the plant, he wants to destroy the seed. And so he's telling his disciples here that even though those things are growing, beware of that and watch out for that. Okay? Okay, Marge, I'm going to have you go ahead and read 35 all the way to the end as we're getting ready to close here.
That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.
Okay, a couple of things as we close here. If Jesus tells you to get in the boat, that you're going to the other side, we can have faith that we're going to make it to the other side. See, again, it goes back to what Jesus was saying. Those of you who have ears to hear, you can hear. And you can understand. He told that to the disciples, but the disciples weren't listening. They didn't hear. Because if they did, they would have had enough faith to understand that even though the storm was going to come up, they were still going to make it to the other side. So they get in the boat. This is the Sea of Galilee again. They start to go over there. Now, as you look at the Sea of Galilee and you look at the geographics, the way that it is, the Sea of Galilee, I think, is 600 feet below sea level. So what happens is the thermals rise off of the Sea of Galilee, and as it's coming in, as the wind and things are coming in from the Mediterranean, you've got a clash of the cold and the warm, and what happens is you have these storms. And these storms on the Sea of Galilee kind of rise at just a moment's notice. And obviously this is what has happened, because as they get in the boat and they're starting to row over there, now this is a pretty good sized boat, because you've got all 12 of the disciples and enough space for Jesus to go in the back of the boat and sleep, right? So this isn't just a big rowboat that they've got there. So this is a pretty good sized ship. So they're going across on the Sea of Galilee, and they're doing what they need to do to get over there. And all of a sudden this storm comes up, and Jesus, what's he doing? He's sleeping through the storm. He's not worried about it, right? Jesus isn't worried about the storms that go on in your and my life, because he knows that he's got a handle on it. Sometimes we may think that he's sleeping, but he's not. So there he is in the back of the boat, he's sleeping. Now, as they're going through here, first of all, there were quite a few of them that were seasoned fishermen who had dealt with these type of storms before, because they were out on the Sea of Galilee all the time, right? So I'm sure that they were doing everything that they could to take care of this area, because they were rowing, they were doing whatever it was that they needed to do to get over to the other side. So they were bailing water, they were doing all this kind of stuff, and all of a sudden the squall is continuing to come up, and all the waves are starting to come around the boat. All the waves are splashing around the boat, they're coming over the boat, and Jesus is still sleeping. Have you ever slept with somebody throwing water in your face? Probably not. But obviously Jesus was. So they're doing all of these things, and finally somebody says to Peter, we better wake him up, right? So they go back, they shake him awake. He's obviously exhausted because he's been ministering to all of these people out on the shore and all of that. And so they wake him up. Jesus, fully God, fully human. Do you think that Jesus got miffed once in a while? I think he did. Fully God, fully human. He gets miffed just like you and me do, right? He probably was a little cranky because they woke him up. So he gets up, and there's several different translations of this as you look at this. But one of the things is that the disciples woke him up and said, do you not care that we're going to die? Now, one of the translations actually was surmising that Jesus got up and he told the disciples to shut up. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But what happens here is that they're in the midst of this storm, and he gets up and he says to the storm, be still, shut up, quit. And immediately the storm stops. Now that was the first miracle. Second miracle was, if you have ever been out in a boat, if you've ever been on a rough sea or in a rough lake or something, and the storm has come and kicked up all of these things, and the waves and everything are crashing and all that stuff, and then the storm moves on, what happens with the waves? They're still going, right? They're still up and down. They're still all around. They're still, the boat's still rocking and all. But what happens is that he gets up and he tells the storm to be quiet, calm down. And not only does the storm completely cease, but all of a sudden the sea gets like glass. It gets completely calm. And these seasoned fishermen, these mariners, freak out. And they go, what have we gotten ourselves into? That this guy even controls the storm and the sea. Can you imagine? You and I would freak out too, right? But the point is that Jesus says we need to go over to the other side. And when Jesus tells you that we're going over to the other side, you can be assured that you're going to go over to the other side. Because when he got up and he after this happens, he turns to them and he says, how is it that you guys still don't have enough faith in this? When you think about that, Jesus was saying to them, if you would have had enough faith in what I told you to do, you could have stood up and told the storm and the sea to shut up and be calm, and it would have done it for you. You wouldn't have even had to wake me up. But he said, how is it that you still don't have enough faith? How is it that all of the things that you have seen me do, and that you've seen my communication with the Father, and all of the things that we've been doing here, how is it that you don't have enough faith? And Jesus is asking you and me that right now, too. How is it I have been a Christian now for pretty much 55 years? That's longer than some of you have been born. And how is it that there are some situations that I still don't believe God will take care of? And how is it that Jesus would be saying to me, do you still not have enough faith in me? Right? That's what he was saying to his disciples, and that's what he's saying to us. He's saying, those of you who have ears to hear, hear. And believe what it is that I'm saying to you, that whatever situation that you're going through right now, whether it's some type of physical limitation, Eric and I were talking while we were eating about the amount of people that are sick and have cancer and have all of these things that are surrounding us right now. We have relatives, we have friends that are sick, some of them are dying because of the world that we are living in. And it's like this, we talked about the pandemic in 2020, but it's like we have this pandemic that is going on of all of these issues and this sickness and all that is plaguing us. And how is it that we still don't have faith enough that God's going to heal us? God's going to take care of us. Those who have ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying. He says it again. Jesus wrote the book of Revelation. You realize that, right? John penned it. But it is the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. Jesus was the one who was given him the words to write. And in the book of Revelation, he says, those of you who have ears to hear, let them hear. Those of you who have ears to hear, let them hear what I'm saying to the churches. Right? That's what he's saying to you and me. Go ahead and stand. Those of us who have ears to hear, we have to let them hear. We have to let them hear, let our ears hear. Because Jesus is saying that he has things in control if we will believe that and if we will accept it the way that he tells us to. So you might be going through some things right now that are like that. And Jesus is not only there ready to calm the storm, but he is also there giving you the power to calm the storm too. Because of the faith of knowing that Jesus is going to handle it, knowing that God's going to be there for us. And that's kind of the whole point of chapter number 4 of Mark here. Jesus, the storyteller, tells them those stories, and then he takes them out on the ocean and he puts those things into practice of the things for our lives. And that's the takeaway. That's the takeaway this week. So, Father, thank you. Thank you for the examples that Jesus gave us while walking on earth. And I thank you, Father, that he was not only completely you, but he was also 100% man, so that he could identify with us and we can identify with him. And sometimes he got miffed. Sometimes he got discouraged. Sometimes he didn't understand why people wouldn't listen to what he said. But Father, I thank you that he went through those things anyway, and that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, they all wrote it down as an account and a testimony to us. That those disciples went through the same things that we did, even when they had the Son of God walking beside them physically. And Father, that you would allow us to understand your words, to not only hear your words, but to understand your words. And to let the seed of your word get into our hearts and to grow 3,000 and 6,000 and 100,000% as we are walking with you. Father, no matter what it is that we are going through, whether it's sickness or whether it's discouragement or financial problems or family issues or whatever it is, Father, let us hear your word, let us understand your word, and let us believe your word so that we understand what it is that you want to do for us and the blessing that you have for us. And Father, I thank you for that. I thank you for our time together. I thank you for our fellowship. I thank you for the stories that Jesus told. And Father, that we could just sit at your feet and listen to your words and be comfortable and comforted and cozy, just sitting there listening to the stories that you tell us. And I thank you for that. I thank you that you bring them down to where we live. And Father, I bless you.